So Kumar, as I was mentioning, AI has come up everywhere this week. And it's not just one conversation. It's about how industries are being reshaped. It's about how the ways that organizations themselves are made up is being reshaped. And leadership, the role of CEOs are being reshaped as well. You work with so many leaders and companies on their AI transformation. What's the biggest shift you're seeing in how businesses need to think about how they operate?
Yeah, great, and it's great to be here, and love the energy. I would put this under three topics, right? One is everybody's talking about AI, but what we are starting to see now is the fluency in AI is getting more to the ethos of an organization. So that's one shift we are seeing. And when I talk about fluency, it's not just saying, hey, I can open up ChatGPT and do a few things with AI, but it's really using AI to be part of how you think about your work, how you deliver the work, how you orchestrate the work, right? Now, that is opening the doors to change how capabilities are being threaded with AI, right? So in the last 2 years, as AI has somewhat gotten mainstream, we've seen a surge in individuals using AI, people kind of using AI, and it is, I'm sure the stats are out there, 60% usage in individual users of AI. But what is different now is now people are starting to say, how do I communicate with what I found with something the other part of the downstream part of the organization needs? And that capability threading and the capability orchestration is starting to get a little bit more dialogue around how do we bring this together. And the third thing, and this is the most interesting and complex challenge that we see that needs to still solve there. If you look at the Mag 7, and largely in the public utility sectors, you see the capital investment that is appropriate for a change of this scale starting to show up. But once you get outside of that and you look at the Fortune 1000 companies, even though if you look at the last 3 years, the capital investment has not caught up to it. So now how do you think about the capital that is required to drive this change and drive the shift? So if you've got the fluency, you know values, how and why value will be created. How do you drive that capability thread into a capital allocation that is more relevant to this economy?
Absolutely. I want to come back to the capital piece in a second. You mentioned scale a minute ago.
Yeah.
In so many industries, even in AI itself, we're seeing small players leapfrog incumbents thanks to AI. Is scale becoming more irrelevant?
No. So scale is shifting. So scale is not irrelevant, but we think the scale is shifting. Like traditionally, you used to define scale as, infrastructures, the biggest capital, the biggest power plants you had. Like you defined it in physical terms. Scale is now shifting from that to communities. How are you serving a network of communities? How are you driving an ecosystem of offering? How are you delivering value very differently, and you're able to drive the economies of scale to deliver the value differently. So the moats around scale are moving from just the physical components and not just accounting for the physical components, but also transitioning to the software components of what you own. And I think that is a slightly different mindset in how you think about scale. Now, interestingly, the threat of new entrants that you talked about is always there, right? We saw it in the e-commerce world, we saw it. But all those entrants eventually cause the change that we're all looking for here. And there are two ways those changes can happen. Those new entrants can become big scale players, right? Eventually that's what their aspiration is. And we are starting to see the presence of this in the Fortune 1000. There's a big need to drive the innovation in a very different way, right? So if you look at traditional Fortune 1000s, they can organically drive some of the innovation. But you can look at some of these upstarts as a way to kind of amplify your innovation as well. And what is interesting is we are starting to see that trend happening as well. So the scale players are looking at these startups as a way of amplifying their innovation. And it will break the deals winter we've been kind of going through to drive the change that we are looking at.
That's exciting. I mean, it's certainly an exciting bullish outlook for M&A there to potentially bring in those AI startups and those accelerating forces into bigger companies.
It has to happen, right? Because if you look at the Mag 7 and the power and utilities, largely you're seeing them drive a big set of innovation. Then you have, just like we saw in the e-commerce world, you have these startups that are disruptors that are starting to show up. But really the change has to happen when these Fortune 1000 companies are innovating at scale. And there are two ways to innovate at scale. Once we solve the capital allocation, which we talked about, the two ways to solve innovation at scale is either you organically innovate, you can kind of like change the ethos of your organization to be more innovative, and I think a lot of the leadership is focused on that. Or you bring in innovation from the outside, which we are starting to see as we notice some of these acquisitions that are happening in the market.
Absolutely. Going back to moats, which you touched on with scale.
By the way, moats is not my term, that's Warren Buffett.
No, of course. But I think there with competitive, like speed is becoming a real competitive advantage and a sort of a moat, especially, I mean, it's always true with startups, I suppose, but especially in AI. How do CEOs think about that challenge? Like, how do you move at the pace of AI innovation iteration without sacrificing your long-term corporate vision? It seems like those two things can kind of come in tension sometimes.
It can come in tensions, but they don't need to be necessarily the paradox that we have thought about in the past as well, right? Because speed has two components to it, right? One is doing things quicker, but also doing things in a transformative way, right? And both can get you the speed that you're looking for. And one of the advices we always share with our clients is, if you're talking about it, let me start slow. Let me think about looking at a targeted place where we can do a use case. That use case purgatory is never going to work because two things are happening. One is you're starting to say, I'll first do this, and then I'll do this, and then I'll do this. You're taking a very, very linear approach to how you're thinking about transformation. And really the power of this comes when, and this is really the power of AI, is when you orchestrate capability evolutions together. And speed can come by taking a much more parallel approach. I mean, the whole exponential growth in AI was because of that change in path in how you thought about speed in compute. Why not use that in how you transform your organizations?
That's a great point. I think part of that challenge and that balance that especially larger companies are trying to find is the temptation to try to do something bold, right? To try to really, how do we, bring something directly to customers?
You all want to hit the home run.
Exactly. Bring something directly to customers that's AI powered, that's industry leading. We've already seen in some different sectors how there can be stumbles in that kind of bold, fast, innovative approach. Like, how are you talking to CEOs today about balancing responsible execution with trying to get ahead of the pack and that bold innovation?
So the way we always, and sports analogies work in some contexts, and so I'm going to, and we use that a little bit. We think about this instead of a defensive and an offensive set of moves, right? So if you're planning for a ball game, you have to play the defense and the offense, right? And the defensive set of moves can be the things that are right in front of you, right? The procurement transformation, the HR transformation, the finance transformation. And those things give you, the fluency, right? People get much more comfortable with it. And when people get much more comfortable with it, they also start innovating. So that opens up the offensive set of moves that allow you to make that big step as well, right? So then you can start thinking about how do you hyper-personalize in your customer transformation? How do you do creative product management? We have a client that is the oil and gas industry, and they're thinking about, hey, from refining, what kind of products do I refine? And do I optimize my product portfolio a different way? That thought process didn't come because they started there, but it's because the the organization became comfortable doing other things that gave them that benefits of the efficiency before they moved into that.
Absolutely. Well, and one way I feel like a lot of organizations are being comfortable with this is through that AI agent model.
Yeah.
I was talking with the chief AI officer of a big federal agency yesterday, and he was saying about he thinks about his AI executions as employees. Like I want to develop an expert in this. I want to develop a skilled operator in that. That agent model can really reshape both the workforce and the operating model, as you were saying, can find some ways to really begin to see some of those efficiencies. Like that seems like a huge fundamental shift for companies that have just literally managed people for a long time. Like, what does it take to build that kind of symbiotic, agentic workforce? It seems intimidating to a lot of organizations.
Yeah. So first of all, people conflate agents with automation, right? And we spend a lot of time saying, if you just needed to automate, you had techniques in the past that you could do it. An agent, by its very nature, it can think, act, it has cognitive, it can make decisions. So when you start thinking about what the agentic model will do for you, it's you start taking components that allow you to work in a superhuman capabilities, right? So I'm making a comparison. But if you had a high productivity employee, how can you make the workforce operate in a very similar high? How do you create high-performing teams that are not wrestling to solve basic problems? And that's kind of where the agent really powers up and amplifies what you do. And I was in exchange with about 20 executives yesterday on this AI topic, and I had the funniest moment on agents, because one of the C-suite who reports to the CEO tells the CEO at one point of time saying, hey, why do you keep asking me for this information? Why don't you go figure this out yourself and create an agent? Because this is just not something, productive. And actually that allowed the CEO to work differently through an executive agent that the CEO now uses to get through some basic information that was important for them to run their jobs.
Absolutely, and I feel like that's such an important corner for leaders to turn, where you go from that initial experimentation, that initial, I'm going to ask ChatGPT a question and maybe I'm not perfectly satisfied with the results and move on. I was talking with a CEO yesterday, and they said their mantra around AI was no more prototypes.
No more prototypes.
They were just sick of having all of these little experiments happening all over the company, and they weren't being adopted at scale. How do leadership teams make that transition? Like, how do you go from letting 1,000 flowers bloom when it comes to all these experiments with AI? Like, how do you jump from that state, which is already a progress in many industries, but to really building a culture where that AI innovation can scale across departments, across levels?
So, and you raised this topic when we talked about agents, right? So as you think about even the agentic architecture, the way value is created is to threading the needle across the capabilities that you need to develop. And when we talk about capabilities, how do you deliver customer intimacy? So it's not about these individual agents or individual AI opportunities that you create, but how do you orchestrate it across a series of it? And I would think about this in terms of how we evolved when we went through the e-commerce and the mobile architecture, right? And as you can see from where we were in 2000 to where we are now, we really have a threaded way of how we view the world. And I think that's what organizations have to think about is how do you orchestrate the work of different agents as you get more AI fluent? How do you orchestrate the work of different AI agents to create a step change in enterprise? This is about driving a step change in enterprise performance. This is about driving a different way of delivering value. And you have to keep that in mind. It's not about incremental opportunities, but a step change in how you drive enterprise value.
Absolutely. Well, looking forward to hearing more about those step changes throughout the conversations this morning. Thank you so much, Kumar, for kicking things off with us.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Appreciate it, sir. Thank you.